Well, welcome back. We're admitting a few more people, but it is my pleasure to welcome Leonard Slutsky. Leonard is the chair of our Gender Diversity Task Force that's working on all of our policies and programming around understanding gender expression, gender identity, and at Kol Ami, which this class is one example. Leonard's gonna say a few words before we turn it over to our fabulous teachers, Ze'evi and Ariel. Leonard?
All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second workshop in the Beyond the Binary series. My name is Leonard Slutsky. I'm here today as both a participant and here to welcome you on behalf of two of the groups here at Congregation Kol Ami, the Gender Diversity Task Force and the Open Yad Project. A little bit about the Gender Diversity Task Force. We're a group of folks here at Congregation Kol Ami that are working to strengthen our congregation's commitment to the LGBTQ community with a special focus on gender diversity and gender expansiveness. We're working on a number of initiatives now, including educational programming, including this wonderful workshop series, opportunities to influence change at the temple, and help our community learn and grow. If you're interested in getting involved, I'm sure we'll share a link in the chat, and you can always email me. We'd love if you're interested in getting involved, if you're inspired by what you hear today, let me know, and we can, we'd love to have you as part of the task force. I'm also here on behalf of the Open Yad Project. The Open Yad Project is our community of Jews and Jew-curious people in their 20s and 30s here throughout Los Angeles. We get together, throughout the year through our various events, including social events, spiritual exploration, and social justice. We host a wonderful monthly Havdalah series, brunch and learns, hikes, and more. And so I encourage you to follow us on social media to learn more about our upcoming events. It is with great pleasure that I can introduce our two wonderful guests today. Ariel Zitny uses he, they pronouns. They're a queer, trans, rabbinical, and education student at the Reformed Seminary Hebrew Union College. Ariel has received a BFA in creative writing from the University of British Columbia and an MFA in creative writing from Chapman University. He has 3 pieces published in Rabbi Egger's collection, Mishkan Ga'ava, Where Pride Dwells. Ariel is passionate about poetry, feminism, and cats. When he's not working, studying, or thinking about ways to make Judaism more trans-inclusive, he enjoys watching Netflix and baking with his partner, Ze'evi, and their 2 cats. Ze'evi Berman, who uses they, them, and ze, zem, zer pronouns, is a student at Hebrew Union College studying toward cantorial education and a master's of Jewish education. Ze'evi describes themselves as queer, trans, non-binary, and genderqueer. They hold a BA in music from Bennington College, and with roots in song leading and music education at the URJ camps and New York City synagogues, Ze'evi believes in the power of communal prayer and song as a tool for social change. As one of the first out trans cantorial students, Ze'evi is passionate about shaping our Jewish communities and Jewish rituals to become places of belonging for trans and non-binary Jews. In their free time, Ze'evi enjoys practicing handstands and baking challah. Ze'evi lives in Los Angeles with their partner Ariel and their 2 cats. Again, thank you everyone for joining us for the workshop today, and I'll turn it over to our 2 speakers.
Thanks so much, Leonard, and thank you for having us at Kol Ami. We are so grateful to be here for a second session. So this class is called Beyond the Binary. We are looking at gender expansiveness as a foundational idea of Judaism that we can find in Jewish text. So as Leonard said, we are Ze'evi and Ariel. My name is Ze'evi. I use they, them, or ze, zem, zer pronouns, and I am a cantorial student and a Jewish education student.
And I am Ariel, just to put the names to the faces, because we are in the same Zoom screen. As said by our bios, we are also in more than just a business partnership, we're in a romantic partnership. So we are Zooming to you from our house, from our apartment together. And we had a question last time about the names of our cats that we mentioned in our bio. So I'll just say our cats are Turtle and Lord Darlington.
So what are we going to do in this course writ large? So this is the second session of 3 different classes.
So we will explore biblical stories through gender expansive commentary. We'll look at various stories from the Torah and read also rabbinic commentaries on those stories, which suggests that our ancestors could have had more gender diversity than we might have originally thought. And so through this study, we will also be learning a little bit more about the Jewish tradition of interpretation and how our rabbis and our teachers of the past have looked at the Torah and interpreted it differently and offered various meanings that can be added to our Torah text. We will also meet the 6 rabbinic classifications of gender, and we will be spending a little bit more time on this section in this class today. So we will unpack a little bit more the 6 classifications of gender and what that means in general. What does it mean to have a classification of gender? And how does this fit into or rebel against the gender binary that we all are familiar with? And in doing this, we will also reconceptualize Jewish belief about gender. A lot of us may have grown up with an idea that traditionally we have a gender binary of male and female, and anything outside of that is new and modern and would be a reform of tradition and a reform of Judaism. But we're here actually to go all the way back, look at our original sources, and try and reconceptualize gender expansiveness not as being a new part of Judaism that we have added, that has been reformed, but seeing that it has been there all along, and over many, many thousands of years and different retellings of history, it has been forgotten or erased. So we are here to bring it back, to resurrect and hopefully help expand this type of expansive thinking to more communities. We know here at Kol Ami, maybe this is not a new conversation, but to help spread it to other people as we meet more people, as we talk about it, to help share that this isn't something new that we are adding onto Judaism. Rather, it's something that's been a part of Judaism for a long time, and we are bringing it back.
So as Ariel said, we are today specifically going to look at the 6 genders of Rabbinic Judaism. So your first reaction might be, 6 genders of Rabbinic Judaism? I thought there were only 2. A lot of us grow up thinking that there are just 2 genders, that we just have binary gender, man or woman, male or female. And actually, when we look at Rabbinic Judaism, that includes classic Jewish texts that were codified as early as 200 CE, about 18 centuries ago. We find that there are 6 different classifications of gender, sort of blowing open our expectations of how Judaism thought of gender thousands of years ago. So we'll be focusing today specifically on one of the 6 genders that is neither man nor woman. And we saw this gender last class. It's called androgynos. And if you remember, we were talking about Adam HaRishon, the very first human being that was created in Genesis. And that we read that the rabbis interpreted this being to be an androgynos, a combination of male and female. But when we read this midrash, this commentary, it seemed sort of mythological. There were some elements of it that were just very fantastical, of a being with 2 faces and sharing a back that was then split down the middle. It seems like mythology. And what's interesting is that the rabbis took this gender of androgynos and applied it to real historical people, real Jews who lived thousands of years ago. So today we will look at a few passages from Mishnah, a classic rabbinic text, a few verses perhaps of Leviticus. If we get to it, we will see, and classic rabbinic commentaries that show us that gender expansiveness, this idea of beyond just man and woman, has been a part of Judaism since its foundation. So as we started last class, we're going to start this class with a Padlet. There are so many different ways to interpret Jewish text, as we learned in the first session. And throughout history, many people have used Jewish text to advocate against inclusivity, saying that Jewish text shows us that there are only a certain few types of people that can be Jews, or only a few types of genders that people can be. So we're going to explore that idea a little bit. We can drop the link in the chat. And we would love for you to reflect on a time that you witnessed a person advocating against inclusivity because they believed there was no precedent for it in Judaism. Exploring these ways that Jewish text has been used against inclusivity can help us frame the ways that we can look at Jewish text for or through the lens of inclusivity. I see that there are a few answers starting to pop up in the Padlet. I see someone commented, sadly, way too many to count. There is a long history of Jewish text being used to advocate against inclusivity, for sure. I see going to an Orthodox synagogue as a child. Ezra and Nehemiah and intermarriage. Often coming from an Orthodox community. We saw it in this last election in Israel from the far right. I apologize if I'm reading your comment before you're done writing it. Splitting men and women at the Western Wall. On the Judaism subreddit, people have written in the wiki that your or our interpretation of rabbinic text is wrong. My community never explicitly said anything exclusive. It was just never discussed. And this is coming from conservative Judaism. Thank you for the prompt to speak louder. I will try to do so. The idea that women have very strict roles in the community. These are all really wonderful examples. It's Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve.
Someone has actually said that to Ze'evi and me. Interestingly, we experienced that walking in a park in Brooklyn. Someone shouted that at us. So that is very common. Yeah. Absolutely.
There are many different ways that Jewish text has been used in an exclusive manner. Having to face bris, even though I'm a trans woman converting. Yes. Mechitza assumptions.
Separation of genders in general. And also looking at what are the experiences of the people in those separate spaces. Are they equally experiencing the prayers or the service or the wall was another one mentioned.
I see some people expressing sadness about all of these examples. For sure, a lot of this is personal and a lot of this is painful. And it is something that Ariel and I have experienced personally, as we shared with that one example, and we could share many more of people using Jewish text to invalidate us as Jews or invalidate our genders. Bar/bat mitzvah, and I'm guessing that within that, an expectation of binary gender. I'm sure we could fill out this Padlet for a long, long time, but let's pivot now to talk about the ways that we can see gender in an expansive way, the ways that we can frame inclusivity as inherent to our rabbinic and our Jewish texts so that we can share these with our community and with other Jews as we learn them ourselves.
So to begin our 6 classifications of gender in rabbinic text, we start with the 2 genders that we are most familiar with. And just to give also a small disclaimer about when we talk about gender, for those of you who maybe have advanced gender theory, this is more of a note for you. For those of you who have less knowledge of gender theory, this is not as important. But just to note that when we say gender, we are including biological factors, physiological factors, as well as sociocultural factors, because that is the cultural context that our ancient rabbis had in 200 CE when they were devising of these classifications. They did not see a separation from biology and social cultural roles. And so when we say gender, in this context, we are going to mirror what they meant by gender and include biological as well as sociocultural aspects. So if that was way too much for you, it's not an important note, but for those of you who were confused, what do we mean by gender? That's just a small note of hopefully of clarification. And so we see here Zachar and Nekeva, and we saw earlier, this was mentioned in the Genesis text of God created human in God's image. Zachar Nekeva, God created them. So masculine and feminine, we see here. Zachar, this term is derived from the word for a pointy sword and refers to phallus. It is usually translated as male in English. Nekeva, this term is derived from the word for a crevice and probably refers to a vaginal opening. It is usually translated as female in English. So we see here much more biological terms, but we will see later that this is not always the case.
So the third classification of gender is one that we have met before. It is the androgynous, which is defined as a person who has both male or masculine and female or feminine characteristics. And just so that you know how prevalent this word is in rabbinic text, there's 149 references to it in Mishnah and Talmud, which are rabbinic texts from the 1st to the 8th century CE, and 350 references in classical midrash and Jewish law codes, which are from the 2nd to the 16th century CE. So this is not sort of a one-off thing. This is referenced over and over in rabbinic texts. So the tumtum is, in contrast to the androgynous, a person whose male or female characteristics are indeterminate or obscured. And again, we find 181 and 335 references in different rabbinic texts. So this is discussed very, very often. And we're going to go more in depth specifically about the androgynous today. It's hard to write a definition for an androgynous. Rabbi Elliot Kukla, who we got this definition from, did some really wonderful in-depth study about this, but there isn't really any diagnostic material in rabbinic text of this is what an androgynous is. And we'll study today some material about how an androgynous can be defined biologically, as well as how an androgynous can be defined socioculturally. So if we were to ascribe modern gender terminology to an androgynous to understand it through our terms, we could say that an androgynous is like an intersex person because biologically they can't be classified as male or female. We could also say that an androgynous could be a non-binary person because socioculturally, they include both masculine and feminine characteristics and can't be defined as a man or a woman. So there's a lot of gray area in here, but just to see the amount of gender expansiveness that we find in rabbinic text. So those are the first 4.
So next we have Elonit, and an Elonit is a person who was assigned female at birth, but who develops male or masculine characteristics at puberty and is infertile. So this is someone who up until puberty is assumed to be a girl, and then instead of becoming a woman, it's realized, it's determined that actually this person is Elonit. This person is not actually a woman. And so they fit this classification as Elonit.
We also have a saris, a person who is assigned male at birth, sort of in contrast to an Elonit, who develops female or feminine characteristics at puberty and or is lacking a penis or testes. So saris is used in two different ways in rabbinic texts. There's two different kinds of saris. The first is a saris chama, a person who is a quote unquote natural saris. This word chama is an ancient Hebrew word for son. So it essentially means that a person has been a saris since the day that they were born. A saris adam, in contrast, is a person who becomes a saris through human intervention. And this is often translated as eunuch when we see it in rabbinic texts.
So next we will look at how we actually encounter the androgynos in some rabbinic text. So Mishnah Bikurim 4 is a chapter of Mishnah Bikurim, which is a book within the Mishnah. So as we said earlier, the Mishnah is a rabbinic text. It's a series of rabbinic books. Much of them are laws, and it's what the Talmud ultimately is based off of. And so Mishnah Bikurim means first fruits, and there is a commandment in the Torah that everyone who has a field must sacrifice, give an offering of the first fruits of their field to the temple. And so Mishnah Bikurim goes into all of the obligations of this commandment of the offering of the first fruits. And so within that, they are saying who is required to fulfill this obligation. And it's mentioned that the androgynos is exempt from the obligation of giving the offering of Bikurim, of first fruits. And so in Mishnah Bikurim 4, we then get an entire chapter that is explaining what are some of the legal obligations of an androgynos. Since we've just found out that they're not required to give the offering of the first fruits, let's go into a little bit of depth. But it doesn't say this is what an androgynos is, this is how you can tell who an androgynos is, this is what they look like. We don't necessarily get that. What we do get is we get descriptions of the androgynos as well as some of their legal obligations. And we have, Ze'evi and I have divided this text into what we would consider to be biological factors and what we would consider to be sociocultural factors. So we have highlighted the biological aspects in blue and highlighted the sociocultural aspects in pink.
So I dropped the link in the chat. When you open it up, you might see like, wow, this is a really, really long text. Don't worry, we're gonna break it down. We're gonna look at it in parts. You don't have to feel overwhelmed. And you can see the key that Ariel was talking about right at the top that shows us how this text can be divided into both biological and sociocultural definitions of the androgynos. So first, we are going to look at this very first bolded number 1, the beginning of Mishnah Bikurim 4. And we read here, an androgynos has in them ways similar to men, ways similar to women, ways similar to both men and women, and ways that are not similar to either men or women. What a complicated definition of gender that we find here. So we can see that the rabbis are grappling with how to fit the androgynous into this binary system of gender. How do we categorize an androgynous according to what we already know about men and what we already know about women? And what I find really lovely is I feel like that's sort of a conversation that we are still having today about gender. That how do we define intersex people according to what we know about male and female? How do we define non-binary people according to what we know about men and women? And we'll see the conclusion that the rabbis draw and what we could learn from that and how we can approach these conversations about gender and about biology today in our conversations in our culture. Okay, so let's keep going.
Okay, so we will read through this, but I understand that it's a lot. We're not going to unpack it. And there's going to be, since this is all mostly legalistic language, there's going to be some of it that will not make sense to you, especially anything regarding emissions or substances. And so I ask, please, let's just skip through the stuff that we don't necessarily understand, but let's try and get a feel for the general feel of it. Just reading it through as a whole piece of text and understanding that this is the entire chapter. There's nothing else outside of this chapter. And this is basically the definitive text on androgynous people. What do we get from it and what do we not get from it? What does it not tell us? And what does it tell us? So we're just going to read through it. And I understand there's going to be a lot that's not going to make sense to you. And thank you for bearing with us. We unfortunately don't have enough time to unpack it line by line, but we will talk more about this text after we read through. So first, as Ze'evi had said, our very first section separated out how androgynous is similar to men, how they are similar to women, how they are similar to both, and how they are similar to neither. And so now we're going to unpack each of those and start with how are they similar to men. They become unclean through white substance like men. They dress themselves like men. They marry but may not be married like men. Their mother sits for blood purity on their account after birth like men. They may not be alone with women like men. They are not supported with the daughters like men. They do not round the corners of their head, and they do not mar the corners of their beard, and they do not become impure for the sake of the dead like men. And they have an obligation for all of the commandments that are in the Torah like men.
Okay, taking that writ large, we'll move on to the second category. How is an androgynous similar to women? And see how this feels in contrast to the first paragraph. They become unclean through red substance like women. They may not be alone with men like women. And I'll pause to say, I did see a chat that said they are not legally allowed to be alone with anyone. We can see how the rabbis are super duper grappling with gender here and trying to fit them into legalistic codes that they might not fit very well in. They are not obligated to levirate marriage like women. They do not receive inheritance with the sons like women. They cannot eat the holy sacrifices of the temple like women. Their mother sits in blood impurity on their account after birth like with women. They are exempt from giving testimony like women. And if they had unlawful intercourse, they are disqualified from eating truma like women. Of course, I will give a caveat that we do not hold by these laws of what is obligated for men and women because we would consider these deeply sexist according to many of our values today. So I will just name that as we are reading through this rabbinic text.
So how is an androgynous similar to both men and women? Guilty are those who strike them and curse them, like men and women. One who kills them unwittingly is exiled, and if with evil intention is put to death, like with men and women. Their mother brings for them a sacrifice after their birth, like with the birth of men and women. They eat the qualified sacrifices, like men and women. They inherit in all the inheritances, like men and women. And if someone says, I will become a Nazirite if this is both a man and a woman, behold, he becomes a Nazirite.
Okay, and this last paragraph, how is an androgynous not similar to either men or women. People do not burn truma on account of the impurity of their discharge. They are not liable for the entering of the temple while impure due to their constant state of impurity on account of their discharge. Unlike men and women, they are unable to be subject to valuation, unlike men and unlike women. They cannot be sold as a Hebrew slave, unlike men and unlike women. And if someone said, I will become a Nazirite if this is not a man and not a woman, behold, he becomes a Nazirite. Okay, that is a lot, a whole lot. So we're wondering if you can drop into the chat a few things that you notice about how the rabbis are grappling with androgynos as a gender. And thank you, Rabbi Egger. This week's Torah portion, Tazria Mitzora, references this passage from Mishnah. Absolutely. What a timely day to be studying this. So I see that someone posted, it seems like the restrictions upon them are defaulting to the stricter option, whether for men or women.
That is such a great point. And actually, I wrote a paper about this text where I did, go more line by line. And that was a big part of it, of they tend to go for what is strict for men, what is strict for women, and how can we apply both of those to the androgynos. And from my perspective, too, it seems like a lot of it is fear of homosexuality, of it's possible for the androgynos, if with a man, that could be a potentially gay relationship. But if with a woman, it needs to be through the proper methods, or else that is improper. They need to be, set up, because then it could be considered to be immodest. And so you see both of those restrictions apply. And yet they end up deciding that it's not good for anyone to be alone, right? Going back to our Genesis text, it's not good for human to be alone. So even though they say the androgynos can't be alone with men and the androgynos can't be alone with women, they do end up saying, but the androgynos can get married because we can't prevent anyone from marriage. That is inhumane to not allow someone to get married.
It sort of subverts the idea that first we overcame homophobia and then we overcame transphobia. In Rabbinic Judaism, it's sort of the other way around. There is an overcoming of this binary notion of gender, while there's still some inherent homophobia that we find in the text that we still have to confront. So they affirm the humanity of the androgynos is another comment we see in here. If someone kills them, the killer is liable. Absolutely. The basic humanity of all people, regardless of gender.
And I think also that's such a nice section of how is the androgynos similar to men and women. We see those human, really the civil rights that unite all of us. So regardless of gender, what is something that is a right that is afforded to someone just based on being a human being?
We also see here, someone commented that it's very concerned with ritual purity and how it is qualified. Yes, this is a very favorite topic of Rabbinic Judaism. What is ritual purity, and how do we make sure that each person stays within the bounds of ritual purity for themselves and their gender? And we can see that ritual purity is endlessly complicated for androgynos, and the rabbis are trying to put boundaries and barriers around it, while these boundaries and barriers are still so gray and so hard to define.
Right, and that also makes it really hard for us as readers to take this information and work backwards to then create definitions for these groups of people, for these categorizations, when so much of our texts about them are these legalistic, very concerned with purity. And that doesn't really mean much to us in our concepts of gender today. We don't think of blood purification as having anything to do with gender. And yet this was how they classified and conceptualized gender.
So I see that someone helped us segue so well into this last bolded section that you might notice we have not read yet, that Rabbi Yossi says, and this is sort of a conclusion of the whole text, an androgynos is a being unique unto themselves, and the sages cannot determine if they are a man or a woman. But it is not so with the tumtum, because sometimes they are a man and sometimes they are a woman. Okay. So based on this Rabbi Yossi quote,
Should I go back to the slide?
sure. Based on this Rabbi Yossi quote, how do you think that this can help us frame the conversations about gender that we are having today? Rabbi Yossi says an androgynos is a being unique unto themselves. How does this relate to the ways that we can frame the conversation about gender in our time today? I appreciate Rabbi Max Chaikin's addendum about rabbinic texts being prescriptive, stating what should be the case according to the rabbi's understanding of ritual law, and that they are not necessarily descriptive of what was happening at any given period of Jewish history. I think that's a wonderful point that we can use to help frame this text for us. Thank you. So what can we learn from Rabbi Yossi? Someone posted, gender is fluid. Absolutely. And another person posted, that sounds like God's uniqueness and a way of being in God's image. I love this connection to the very first class that we had, looking at this idea of B'Tselem Elohim. What does it mean to be made in God's image? Perhaps it means to be a being unique unto yourself, that each person is made unique, and yet we are all made B'Tselem Elohim.
I think there was a question too about the tumtum, because the tumtum here is said to be different from the androgynos, and androgynos is a being unique unto themselves, but the tumtum is sometimes a man and sometimes a woman. The tumtum, it's believed that the tumtum does have a binary gender. It's just not able to be seen what their binary gender is. And so until their binary gender is revealed, they are classified as tumtum. And so tumtum could possibly be actually a man or actually a woman. We just don't know that until that is revealed. But in androgynos, it's not possible for them to at any point in time be classified as male or female. So that is the distinction there.
It's a little bit harder to describe that in modern gender language than it is for the androgynos. I see another person said, we can learn from Rabbi Yossi that if the rabbis can't tell, then humankind can't tell. So maybe we should stop trying. Perhaps we can't understand complex gender, non-binary gender, through the lens of the binary. Perhaps we need to come up with another way of understanding it that isn't rooted in just our understandings of men and women. And I also want to acknowledge that another person dropped in the chat some difficulty that they have had with Jews not acknowledging their gender. And for sure, this is why we started this course by saying, how has Jewish text been used to promote exclusivity? And I think that for us today, we're learning ways to show that all of our genders are holy. All of our genders are unique, and that is a wonderful and good thing that is foundational to Judaism that we find in some of our classic Jewish texts.
And I think also a lot of us are told that we are offensive to God just by our very existence, that living authentically is offensive to God. And I think when at least I read this and I read that Rabbi Yossi is saying it's not offensive to God, it's the beautiful variation of God's creations, that actually it's the opposite, to look at a creation of God and to say, we are going to deny the reality of this person and put them in something that doesn't fit them. That is actually what is offensive to God, by trying to categorize something that cannot be categorized.
And we had a question about the societal or the sociocultural aspects of gender in these definitions. If you go back to the link that I dropped for Mishnah Bikurim 4, you'll see that all of the highlighted parts in yellow or in pink, depending on the color of your screen, are sociocultural ways that we define and understand an androgynous through the lens of society and culture, and not through the lens of biology.
So things like what clothes that they wear, how they might cut their hair, that actually isn't physiological, even though it has to do with our physical beings. It's all influenced by culture, and it depends on culture. And those are things that we have as cultural or as social signifiers of gender.
I'm glad that helped to clarify a little bit. So we'd love to hear from you. How do the rabbis view gender? And how is this different from your view of gender? As well as, what does it mean to you for the androgynous to be a, quote, being unique unto themselves? What is the significance of these texts that we just read for you as a person in our modern Jewish society today? I see that it's affirming to someone in our class today. It's also definitely really affirming to us, and this is why this is a subject of our study as two non-binary clergy students. It's liberating. I see another comment. It means people have had to deal with these issues for generations. I love the idea that existence beyond the binary is recognized and affirmed in the text. The androgynous are human beings. The rabbinic view of gender seemed to include a lot of physical, biological features that we attribute more to sex today and view gender as something distinct from. Absolutely. And I see that speaks to our first question about the differences between rabbinic gender and our understandings of gender today. Even though it says that this is in rabbinic texts, is there a history of rabbis accepting the 6 genders in society? The hard part is we don't know. We have here the texts that we have presented to you. We know that they grappled with it. We know that it was a part of discourse important enough to codify in our Jewish texts. We don't have a history of how exactly it was dealt with outside of the rabbinic canon.
We do know, though, that in Jewish law codes, in legal texts that were written even after the Mishnah and Talmud, like in Maimonides' Mishnah Torah and the Shulchan Aruch, they still mention these different genders, these 6 different genders, and how they can follow halakha, how they can follow Jewish law. And so even though we don't know about whether or not rabbis were actually interacting with human beings that they classified as one of these 6 genders, we do know that the rabbis still included their legal obligations, the legal obligations of these 6 different genders, in our law codes. So it was believed to be real enough to include in legal writings. But there are lots of individual rabbis who say, you know, this is theoretical, this is hypothetical, this is a possibility, but it's not a reality. And we know that there are people who say, just because it's written about doesn't mean that it exists in our society today too. And so it really comes down, I think, to the person and to the teacher of what do we take from our texts and how seriously do we take them? Do we apply them to our own lives? And do we adapt them? As we said also that some of these seem to be very physiological and some of them had nothing to do with physiology at all? And how do we apply that to our current understanding of gender, knowing that the way that the rabbis understood gender was very different from how we understand gender today? Just like how they understood what a spark was or what creating a flame was is very different than how we understand that today. And we adapt our understandings to fit our modern world.
This is another good point, that the rabbi's view of gender, similar to what Max helped us reflect on, is that it's rather prescriptive. It isn't so much a self-definition, that the rabbis ascribed gender to others rather than how we ascribe gender to ourselves, and how gender is a deeply personal understanding. And my response to this, our response to this, is that we read rabbinic texts as progressive Jews today to find ourselves in these texts, not as a way to legislate or prescribe our lives, but as remnants of gender expansiveness in our Jewish canon, in Jewish history. So we can see ourselves in this text while understanding that the rabbis' ideas of gender vary greatly from the ways that we understand gender in modern Judaism today. So we have one more text that we would love to explore with you. This is also a section of Mishnah.
So just to give a little example of how androgynous or tumtum might be used outside of this sort of legalistic framework, in Mishnah Nazir, just to give a very short intro into what Mishnah Nazir is, it's another book of Mishnah, and this one is dealing with the Nazirite vow. And a Nazirite is a person who takes on extra mitzvot, extra commandments, in sort of an extra state of holiness, generally as a promise made to God in exchange for something. A lot of times, you know, it's like we do this, I think, even in modern society of like, oh, please, God, if you give me X, I will do Y. And so we see that with the Nazirite vow, where if someone takes a vow where they say, if God, you grant me this thing that I am asking for, I will become a Nazirite, we see that that's binding. They take this vow very seriously. And so Mishnah Nazir goes into the obligations of someone who takes a Nazirite vow. So that being said, here's our text. If one says, behold, I will become a Nazirite if I have a son, and a son is born to them, they become a Nazirite. If the child is a daughter or a tumtum or an androgynous, they do not become a Nazirite. However, if they said, I will become a Nazirite if I have a child, then even if that child is a daughter or a tumtum or an androgynous, they become a Nazirite. So when I read this text, I'm thinking of the question, what does it mean to have a son versus what does it mean to have a child? And what do we see included in that definition of child? And then how is this text an example of inclusion? Oh, we have a good question. So do they become a Nazirite if the son turns out to be a saris later? That is a great question. And I could see an entire debate on that question of maybe they become a Nazirite until the child is discovered to be a saris. But I love that question. You are thinking like our rabbis.
So how can we see here that the rabbis are grappling with the issue of inclusion in this text?
If you do a gender reveal party, you are gambling on your vow. That is a great point. I think also, when I think about that, it comes back to, what are our assumptions, right? What are our assumptions when we say child? And maybe if someone says child, they're really envisioning a daughter or a son. That's what they're thinking of when they say child. But the rabbis are saying that might be your assumption, that if you are going to have a child, you will have a daughter or a son. But you need to remember that it's possible also to have an androgynous or a tumtum, and you've still been blessed with a child. That blessing has still come true, and you are still obligated for your oath because of it. Oh, I'm sorry, Christine. Christine just mentioned the second part of the text suggests that having a child is a gift, regardless of what gender it is. Exactly. Oh, and I see also Duke, outside of essentially breeding males, everyone else is a human child still, just not the patriarchal link. Exactly. And that also, I think, offers a really accurate view of rabbinic view of gender. Is it's kind of men and everyone else. And the everyone else group is actually bigger than we thought. We thought the everyone else group was just women, but it's more inclusive. But you're right, we still see this patriarchal lifting up of men, of the males of the sun. But that everyone else category is maybe a little bigger than we thought.
It also makes me think of in modern day, when we say that we're going to have a baby, many of us think of having a boy or having a girl. And what's really lovely to me is in this text that was codified in 200 CE, 18 centuries ago, the rabbis were thinking of gender beyond just boy or girl. The rabbis are thinking, what if this child is an androgynous? What if this child is a tumtum? And one of you added, what if this child is a saris? And we could add, what if this child is an ilonit? Gender has been expansive in Judaism for centuries, for thousands of years, and we're only now just beginning to come around to these texts and to bring them into our modern Jewish canon to say, we need to look at gender beyond the binary today too. So as we finish up, we have another Padlet for you all. We've read a few texts today on the androgynous, and we saw the rabbis grapple with, how do you define gender beyond the binary according to the systems of understanding in biological and sociocultural and legal frameworks. And we saw that the rabbis essentially said, you cannot define genders beyond the binary according to the binary. You need to let them be their own categories, unique onto themselves. And that actually each person and each gender is unique onto itself. All of us are unique people. So we would love to know from you how you want to continue in this tradition of the rabbis in transforming our Jewish texts to be models of inclusion. Maybe taking texts that on their surface might not have so much to tell us about how we include people beyond the binary, but that we can interpret in ways that show us how to be inclusive, how to be expansive in our thinking. So feel free to follow the link in the chat or type the link into your browser. And we would love to know from you, how do you want to continue this tradition of finding inclusivity in Jewish text today? I see there are a few people typing. We'll give them some time before I start reading your incomplete comments.
Here, I can pull it up on the share screen.
I see a comment. Oh, I think it's still in progress, so I'll wait just a little bit. one of the things I think is incredibly important, says one comment, is creating gender inclusive spaces where there have previously been spaces for only men and women, such as bathrooms. And a comment on that comment, I would be happy if there was general knowledge that this was thought about centuries before. Yes, absolutely. We should allow room for discussion, confusion, complexity, gray areas. I think these are wonderful takeaways from these very complex Jewish texts that we grappled with today. Be comfortable to ask questions about the texts and discuss with others. Welcoming everyone in Judaism, cis, non-binary, and trans individuals, also not precluding people based on gender.
Inclusive translations of the texts are very important, especially to clarify issues like Adam and man, which we talked about a little bit last class for those of you who missed our first session, about how Adam is usually translated either as man or as the person Adam, but actually in Hebrew, it's just the Hebrew word for human. And how can we shift our thinking from man to human?
There are so many comments, we could not hope to read all of them aloud. I hope that you will continue writing in this Padlet, and I look forward to scrolling through it and learning from the ways that you want to make Judaism more inclusive using Jewish texts. We look forward to reading it later.
And I hope those of you that know each other, or maybe even if you don't, that you can reach out to each other and continue this conversation. I see someone has asked for advice on maybe what to do for a brother that is expecting a child. I don't have any advice for you, but if someone wants to continue that conversation, that is a really excellent question, and something that I think a lot of people are dealing with, of how do we approach this gendering of children in our society, especially as we're moving toward a more gender inclusive and gender expansive society.
Thank you all for your knowledge and for your insights and for continuing to add to this Padlet, which is a wealth of knowledge for all of us. It was really wonderful to get to learn from you and to study these complex remnants of gender expansiveness in our Jewish canon. So thank you all so much.
And we have one class left that we will go more into Torah stories. So if you are asking, where is the Torah, we will bring back the Torah next week.
Thank you so much, Ze'evi and Ariel, for really teaching us and leading us and being such excellent teachers of Torah to us, and helping us, most of all, expand what we were raised as, the society that we've lived in. We are all affected by it regardless of our ages, and it's really refreshing to be able to approach with new eyes and hopefully a new spirit our tradition and create it in as it should be. So thank you so much for teaching us today. We will look forward to seeing you all next Sunday at 4 p.m. on the 18th of April. In the meantime, you don't want to miss Tuesday at 5:30 Pacific time, Chef Jake Cohn, his brand new cookbook, Jew-ish, is top of the charts of all the cookbooks, #1 on Amazon. He's going to celebrate Israel Independence Day with us by cooking Israeli food and helping us get in the spirit. So please join us Tuesday at 5:30. If you're interested in purchasing the cookbook, we have them for sale at Congregation Kol Ami. If you go to our website at kol-ami.org, we'll be happy to send you one for the cost of shipping and handling. And we look forward to seeing you then, and lots of other great programs. So again, thank you to Ze'evi and to Ariel, our teachers, and always to Leonard for his leadership, and of course to Rabbi Chaikin, the master really at Kol Ami, for everything. So thank you all for being with us, and have a great rest of your Sunday and a good week. Shavua Tov.
Have a great week, everyone.